Well, clearly my YouTube career has taken off because we're back with a second video. So this is lesson two. What are the main functions of Parliament and why have they become controversial? It is really important, this lesson. This lesson allows us to understand the functions of Parliament. What is the point of a Parliament? We kind of know what it is, we see it, we now know who sits in it, but what does it do? And the way I wanted to start this, and I have to say I was really kind of interested to see the stuff you put on Google Classroom. The way I wanted to start this was by asking that question by looking at a case study. And I gave you the example of Apsana Begum. Now, you may well know that she is the new MP for Limehouse and Poplar. She took the seat in 2019 from the retiring MP Jim Fitzpatrick. And I did link this video at the time. This was her first speech. We call it the maiden speech in Parliament. It's generally seen as the most important speech an MP gives because it's on the record and it's them setting out what they're going to do when they're in Parliament. So it's a really useful way to see what an MP's intentions are. And watching it, I'm sure you'll agree, she had a clear sense of what her role was. And I want to come back to Apsana because I think her particular speech here speaks to some of or has a clear reference to some of the five major functions we refer to when we talk about the functions of Parliament. But it was a very strong speech. If you haven't watched it yet, I'd advise you to go and watch it. The link's in the PowerPoint. And in recent days, she's been looking to represent the grievances or redress the grievances, shall I say, of local constituents, particularly with the kind of grim realities of potential number of people that could die and the burial practices of particular people who do sadly pass away, whether they'll have a right to, push for a non-cremated burial, which is obviously something that many of her Muslim and Jewish constituents in Limehouse and Poplar would be concerned about. So that's an example of a redress of grievance. She signed a bill, basically, which is basically her saying to this law going through, can we make a slight change? It's called an amendment. She pushed for that amendment and managed to get it through. So she could be seen there to be representing the interests of her constituents by doing that. But you gave some really good examples of Diane Abbott, of several others in the comments, which are brilliant. And I really would urge you to hold on to those when it comes to exam time. Some key words that you're supposed to put in your glossary. I don't need to talk through these. We know what a legislature is. It's something that passes laws. It doesn't necessarily make laws, but it passes laws. In our country, we call that Parliament. We have a system of parliamentary government. So maybe I do need to talk through this a bit because this is a really crucial concept. We've talked about this before. In the UK, to be a member of government, you have to be a member of Parliament. To be a member of government, you have to be a member of Parliament. Whereas in the US, to be a member of government, you cannot be a member of the legislature. You cannot be a member of Congress. There is therefore in the UK what we refer to as a fusion of powers between the two. An important thing to remember when we come back to it. The Westminster model is really a phrase used to refer to the concept of parliamentary sovereignty, but also of the ways in which politics works in this country. It all revolves around this institution of Parliament. And as I get bored of telling you guys, ask your history students, ask the history students among you for why that is. But Parliament has been this totemic institution in the history of the UK. And then finally, bicameralism. Actually, the UK and the US both have bicameralism because we have two chambers in our parliament. Some countries don't. I think a notable example of a non-bicameral country is, if I remember rightly, Bangladesh only has one chamber. That would be a unicameral system, but we are a bicameral system. So, task C, this is where it got a bit more tricky. Task C obviously referred to looking at the functions of the House of Commons, and there are nominally 7 here. Yeah, we're going to kind of try and boil those down in a second, but there are nominally 7 here. So I'm going to talk through these in turn, and maybe we'll have some time to boil them down. So, legitimation. Very simply put, because of our Westminster model, where Parliament is at the centre of everything, legitimation, the legitimacy given to politicians in acting, in taking decisions, in using their power, really originates from Parliament. Parliament is the originator of sovereignty in our country, and it is also therefore the originator of legitimacy, because our House of Commons is elected, given a mandate to rule and a mandate to represent, and that therefore is a crucial function of Parliament, to legitimate. It does this many moments. In fact, in some ways, it does this throughout the 5 years of a normal parliamentary session, or parliamentary normal lasting of a parliament. But there are some key moments. Key moment number one is the passing of a budget. We've talked about this before. Governments can't govern without money. Budgets are there to legitimate and allow governments, shall I say, to govern. And this is a classic example of when legitimation occurs. If, as a kind of counterfactual, legitimation is not there, or a government is seen as illegitimate, it is very common that their budgets will not be able to be passed. And another classic example of this is during Queen's speeches. Queen's speeches, which most of you will think of when you think of the Queen's speeches, what happens at Christmas. That is not a Queen's speech, that is a Queen's Christmas message. What we're talking about here is a Queen's speech, which is this kind of ceremonial moment in which the government sets out its agenda in Parliament for the coming session, for the coming year. And that will be given by the Queen generally, or Prince Charles if the Queen's not well enough. Although at the moment it sounds like he's got coronavirus, so if it was done today, it would probably be done by another royal. But it's there because technically the government is still nominally Her Majesty's government, and so she is the figurehead of it. But the speech is written by government, and it's basically them saying, this is what we want to do this year. And then Parliament say, all right, we'll give you a chance to do it. And that is the legitimation provided. I've given some examples here in my slide, but you may want to give others. The role of Parliament is to legislate as well, of course, and passing laws, not making laws, because that's generally devised by the executive, the PM and cabinet, as we looked at in the last section. But passing laws is done by Parliament. How and when does the Commons do this? It is normally done, though, by the executive pushing laws or making laws, coming up with laws and pushing them through Parliament. But Parliament does do the process of legislating on it, and we're going to look at that in more detail. But the process by which a law is made is legislated. That is the process of making a law, and that is done through Parliament through multiple stages, and it is a really quite detailed, heavy process that it goes through. And I've given an example here, but there are so many more. Making government accountable is the third function, and this is what we talk about when we say that government is held to account by Parliament. Under parliamentary government system, government sits in Parliament, but the flip side of that system of parliamentary government is that government is held to account by Parliament. PMQs is the most obvious example every week, but actually probably not the most effective. Committees, and particularly what we refer to as select committees, are really where a lot of the accountability occurs. And government are held responsible for their actions. In reference to number 4, scrutiny of legislation occurs. When laws get passed through Parliament, they get looked at. They get looked at in detail, in real painstaking detail. If you think reading through a politics textbook is tiring, you should not become an MP, because MPs look through laws in so much detail. And for instance, the finite, let's say, pulling apart of Theresa May's Brexit withdrawal bill between 2018 and 19 is probably the most notable example of this, where MPs from all sides of the chamber, in the Commons and even in the Lords as well, but primarily the Commons, looked at every single word being used, whether it was a backstop, a customs arrangement, a Norway model. All of these terms were looked at and scrutinised before a bill was eventually passed, and in fact it never was, because Parliament would not legislate on it. Representation, and this is actually, I think, where we bring in Apsana Begum, because Apsana Begum looking to represent her constituents, and your case studies as well. This is actually one of the more common and, let's say, more popular understandings of what the MPs do. They're there to represent their constituents, and I don't think this is that tricky. I think just looking at examples of it is probably what you need to try and have. Representation of interests. This is a bit different to representation of constituents. There may be MPs who see themselves as representing a particular section of society. Absama Begum talks about the working classes and the multicultural parts of London or of the UK. MPs sometimes see themselves as, if they're from trade unions originally, representing workers and their interests. And finally, national debate. And I think this is a more intangible function, but the function nonetheless of facilitating debate in the country, whether that be debate on how to best deal with coronavirus or debate on the way forwards on Brexit. And certainly Parliament was at the front and centre of debates over Brexit over the last 3 to 4 years. But facilitating that debate can be done in the chamber at multiple different moments when bills are being passed through, or many different ways in which Parliament can facilitate that debate, and the press and the media will cover it, and the public will then contemplate it, and it will affect their decisions at the next election. So they should have done that. In the House of Lords, we see a slightly different set of functions, some of them very similar, but knowing its limits is really important part of that. Knowing its limits here, super important, because the House of Lords since 1949 has lost, well, actually since 1911, sorry, should I say, the Parliament Act of 1911 has lost its veto power. It cannot block any laws, it can delay them. And since 1949, it can only delay really the process for a year. It cannot veto. It does not have that power because it's not seen to have that legitimacy. And that's really important to understand. It does give that, therefore, the Lords a power of delaying legislation and delaying action, asking Parliament, the House of Commons, to look again, asking them to look again at certain pieces of legislation, and there are examples of that in the textbook. But this is to be done sparingly, because the House of Lords is a controversial institution, as we'll come to debate. It is very controversial. Scrutiny and revising of legislation. Many members of the House of Lords are lawyers themselves and will look over the legislation in as much detail, if not more so, than the House of Commons. They have a lot of time on their hands. Bear in mind, some of them are, as we mentioned last lesson, crossbenchers. They don't have a particular political affiliation, so they will look at it potentially in a neutral manner, you may want to argue. And they may do that not only with primary legislation being passed, but secondary legislation. These are powers that ministers and the executive have taken for themselves from previous pieces of legislation, but they need to still be scrutinised. The government may take actions without the Commons having to give the approval, but that may necessarily, that those powers may not necessarily be being used correctly, and that's something that the Commons don't necessarily always have the time to look at. So the Lords take on that function. And finally, national debates. They are part of that national debate, for instance, over Brexit or over COVID-19, and because of the specialisms that some of those life peers have, because of their previous experiences, maybe their specialisms are the kind of thing that the House of Commons do not have, that the House of Lords will take that role on in facilitating debate as well. And that brings us to the plenary questions, which I think this lesson a bit more interesting and potentially a bit more controversial, and something we need to get our teeth into. So first off, are there functions that both the Lords and the Commons do? Yes, we've looked at that. For instance, we talked about debate, we talked about scrutiny of legislation, but the Commons are the only house that really do legitimate, I think it's worth saying. Representation, you could argue that Lords represent certain interests in society, but they don't have any geographical or constituency representation. So there are some functions that one do and one and the other don't. The Lords are there to delay. The Commons isn't really there to delay. It's there to scrutinise and basically say yes or no. But ultimately, there are some functions that they share. And finally, the last question, last two questions, according to Brexiteers, what are the most important functions of Parliament and why? And the reason I wanted to bring that question out was because during the kind of deadlock over Brexit, Brexiteers would say the function of the Commons is to represent the people and represent the interests and the say of the public. And the say of the public was, in a referendum, we want Brexit. And so a lot of Brexiteers were saying, why can't you just get on with it? Whereas a lot of Remainers were saying that the function of Parliament was not necessarily just to represent, but also to scrutinise, to take time, to legislate, and to be and hold the government accountable. And so it's quite interesting at moments of big political struggle, what the functions and what most purposefully what the most crucial function of Parliament was up for debate. And different sides of the Brexit debate were making those arguments because they had different particular political interests. Anyway, I hope that makes sense. And I know I went on for a bit longer than last lesson, but I do think that these debates are interesting and important, and they will definitely come up later on when we start doing some 13 markers on it. But for now, goodbye.
Man's never been in marquee when it's shut down, eh? Trust me, daddy.
Yeah. Hey, man's never been in when it's shut down. That's not me and it's shut down.